I'm so glad to be here with our esteemed panelists today. I'll do introductions in a minute, but I want to recognize that throughout the past day and a half, we've heard people discussing how do we measure all of these important things that people are sharing, trust and respect, and the outcomes of that engagement that are so powerful. And today's panelists will share ways that they conceptualize measurement and outcomes, not just of the engagement process, but also when collaborating authentically with community partners, what those outcomes are that have happened during their processes. And so the agenda for today's panel is going to be slightly different than what you've experienced before. We're going to start as usual with the presentations by the panelists. Then we're going to ask that the audience consider questions that the panelists asked of you. So in preparation for this panel, our panelists asked you questions that they would like to think about. And we're going to ask that you consider these and talk amongst yourselves at your table, and I'll be coming around and asking you to share your responses collectively. And then at the very end, we will engage you in asking questions of our panelists. We'd like you to maybe consider writing those questions down on a shared Google document so that our panelists may all fully participate in thinking about those questions in advance and potentially responding to those questions asynchronously or after the panel to give more time for panelists to consider the questions that you've asked and an opportunity to type responses to your questions. So, in the spirit of keeping on time, I'm going to ask that you all open up this Google document and keep this open so any questions that you might have of the panelists can be documented during the session. And for our panelists that prefer to use spoken language to answer, I will read those questions to the panelists and they will answer using their preferred form of communication. So hopefully everyone has had a chance to access this Google Doc. I'll give a few more seconds here. I still see some phones raised. Sometimes QR codes can be tricky. Okay. Let's move on to our panelist introductions. Dr. Clayon Hamilton has been conducting health services research for over a decade and holds adjunct faculty appointments at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University. Currently, he's a health system lead in knowledge exchange and mobilization at a Providence-wide integrated youth services network in British Columbia, Canada. Alison Hoens is a person living with rheumatoid arthritis and multiple comorbidities. She's a physiotherapist and knowledge mobilization specialist with expertise in engagement of patients, families, and clinicians in healthcare research. Dr. Pham is president and CEO of the Institute for Exceptional Care and is also a general internist, national health policy leader, and mother to two beautiful young men, one of whom is autistic. Dr. Pham was previously vice president, provider alignment solutions at Anthem, Inc., responsible for value-based care initiatives. Prior to Anthem, she served as Chief Innovation Officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. Huan Vuong is a 27-year-old non-speaking autistic who spells to communicate on a letterboard or keyboard. Juan has surpassed expectations, having earned his high school diploma online and an associate's degree at Northern Virginia Community College. Juan majored in English and wants to be a writer. Juan currently lives in an apartment with a roommate in Arlington, Virginia, and enjoys the safety and community life it offers. He works part-time at an electronics recycling company and participates in community activities and self-advocacy work. He hopes to make a difference, sharing his life experiences and helping others with disabilities. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. And I'm going to turn over the slides to Dr. Clayon Hamilton.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Are you hearing me? Yeah. Okay, can hear me. That's good. I was hoping that you would be able to hear me. I'm very happy to be here and to be joined by this esteemed panel. I came in yesterday from Vancouver, and this is a very lovely hotel that you have here. I was a couple of days I spent in another, I'm from Vancouver, but I spent the last couple of days in another region of Canada at another conference, another summit actually, and dealing with integrated youth services. And we really talked a lot about engaging youth in that conference, that summit. And so it's really great to be here to continue talking about how do we engage with community partners and how do we go about measuring and documenting the process and outcome of engagement. And so what I want to, our part of the presentation today will touch on some work that we started back in 2015, having to do with a scale that we developed called the Patient Engagement in Research Scale. And at the time of developing the scale, we really talked about what do we call it, because there have been shifts in terminologies, and sometimes there was a point where the word consumer was being used a lot. There were times when public is being used, family engagement, but we understand that there are differences in sort of terminology. Community engagement by some is overlapped with what's considered patient or family or engaging people's lived and living experience and youth and so on. So today we use the word patient engagement in research for much of our presentation, just because that's how we've been using it, and it goes with the scale that we developed. And so, continuing on here, so we're from the beautiful lands of the Coast Salish peoples in British Columbia, and I work out of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nation peoples, and Alison as well. And so you can see there's some Coast Salish art on your left, and beautiful lands of British Columbia there on the right. And so we want to start with the takeaway. Today, the patient engagement in research scale, the 22-item version, is a valid and reliable tool for assessing the degree of meaningful patient engagement or meaningful engagement of patients and family partners in research. It enables standardized assessment of patient and family caregiver engagement in research across various contexts. And so with our presentation today, we will break this down a bit, and so you can get this takeaway from our presentation. Alison.
Thank you, Clayon. And it's a pleasure to be here as a physical therapist, as a patient, and as a knowledge broker. I have enjoyed listening and learning from and with you all over the past couple of days. And when we think of the term privilege, I'm privileged not only to be white and be housing secure and income secure and food secure, but I'm also extremely privileged to be a part of Dr. Hamilton's team to really meaningfully be engaged as a partner and looking at meaningful engagement and how we measure it in research. So this was a 3-phase process that was undertaken. First of all, we had to develop a framework. The value of models, theories, and frameworks in your profession. And the scale is important to develop that framework. What we measuring community engagement or patient engagement in research has traditionally been derived from the researcher point of view. Researcher perspective. This is unique. It is the only scale that has been developed from the patient or the person with lived experience. Then we developed from that framework, developed and pre-tested a new scale, and then conducted validation of the scale and refined the scale. Sure, sorry. Is that better? Did you get any of that? Okay. Thank you. So, why do we do this? What's the rationale for it? Well, it's important that if you don't measure it, how do you really know if you're doing it well, and how do you improve it? So it was important not only to measure, but also to be able to measure any strategies that you use. Look at the effectiveness of strategies for meaningfully engaging. Then to improve the quality of partnerships on individual research projects. So if you're working with a team, how do you measure the engagement in your own project? And then you might want to compare across research networks how one project was engaged versus another. And then from a dissemination or a KT science point of view, what are the associations? If you can actually measure at an individual level or across projects, you can start to identify associations between the quality of the engagement and the outcomes from it. This was the first paper that reports the framework itself. And that framework is derived from 2 mechanisms. From interviews with patient partners. There were 18 patient partners who were engaged in research teams over various durations of periods of time. And we're going to try this one, which I'll hold out here. Okay. So those interviews then formed the basis, together with evidence from the about what was known about meaningful engagement in research. And what you see in front of you here is a graphic of the framework. You see meaningful patient engagement is in the middle, and on the outside are 8 domains of that meaningful engagement. And I like to call those the essential ingredients. Think of it if you were thinking of your secret sauce for engaging with community members well. What would be those fundamental elements from the perspective of the patient or the perspective of the consumer or the perspective of the community partner, in addition to what is known from the literature? So there's things like, what are the benefits? Feeling valued, support, the research environment, team interaction, and convenience. So these domains, or these essential ingredients for that secret sauce, were derived empirically, and then how they were named and how they were defined were done in conjunction with 4 partners, 4 community partners, and 2 researchers. So this wasn't undertaken by Dr. Hamilton by himself. Every word, process, and the process over a number of years to develop this framework was done, co-developed with community partners. And now on to the next.
Thank you very much, Alison. So now we'll talk a little bit more about the development and validation of the patient engagement in research scale, going off developing the framework. So this was a second paper where we first developed a 37-item version of the patient engagement in research scale. And so it was done through a series of steps, starting with, similar to the data set that we used to develop the framework, we also use that data set to identify the items for the questionnaire or the survey or scale, And so we did it through a process of thematic analysis where we looked working as a part, the team, including the patient community partners, where we generated 120 statements or items that as a starting point, and went through a process of E-Delphi, are kind of trying to build consensus on which items are the key ones to include in the scale. And so this was done with another new set of participants, different from the item generation stage. And in this stage, we included 12 patient partners or community partners, patient partners from across Canada, who then participated in a E-Delphi process that identified over our 3 rounds of this consensus building process, identified 43 items that they thought were good for the questionnaire. And so through the E-Delphi process, there was a refinement of items and so on, which then led to a pre-testing of this 43-item version through what's called cognitive testing, where what happened is that we designed the questionnaire and we sat with individuals, another group of 12 individuals, who then who were diverse in many different ways, who then would be completing the questionnaire, and as they completed it, they told us what they were thinking about the questions. They told us whether it was comprehensive, whether it was understandable, whether the response scales for each of the question was appropriate, where there were words that could be changed, and so on. And so this led to the making changes and removing redundancy and so on from the scale, ending up with 37 items. And so what this done was to create a 37-item version of the peers that is valid in terms of the content in the scale, and also in the questionnaire, and also in terms of when one look at it, they perceive it to be measuring patient engagement in research. And so during that process of developing the 37-item version, where we have these 8 components, we found that 2 of the components really closely connected, just because of the number of items that we ended up. And so that's that research environment and team interaction domain, if you may. So in terms of the peers, 22 that we'll be touching on, it has actually 7 subdomains that covers those 8 themes of meaningful patient engagement in research. And so folks, after we published the 37-item version, folks told us that the questionnaire could be shortened. And we also needed to validate certain key measurement properties of the questionnaire for it to be a sound measurement tool. And so we took on another project, and that's this, another phase of the project, and that's this paper here. And so where we shortened the 37-item version, and we also evaluated and provided validation of its measurement properties. And so we included a data set of 119 participants. And so participants, of course, were patient partners or community partners from Canada and the United States. We had a reasonably diverse sample in terms of gender, age, education, and they were from 2 countries. And they were from across Canada in terms of the participation. And so what we found in terms of the measurement properties is that for these new 22-item version, what happened is that we removed items that were redundant when they seemed to have been measuring closely the same thing, or it seems as if they sort of didn't align with sort of what all the other items were measuring. And so in doing that, we were able to create a scale that has only can produce one score. And so all of the 22 items can be combined together to produce one number. And so that so what we call that is structural validity. And so here we are able to combine all 22 items to say, just like a ruler, you're able to have a score that when you calculate all of the responses, you're able to say that this score, a difference between a value of 70 is more than a value of 50, which is not always the case with measurement tools. And so we had to go through the process of validating that. And in terms of, you see there explained variance, 55%, that's actually very good in terms of saying that that one score that you get from each person when you combine all of their responses, that one score is really representing a lot of what person is experiencing in terms of when it comes to their engagement in a project. It's also shown that it's internal consistency, meaning that the items can reliably be combined together. We also saw where for similar tool, it correlated well, meaning that the tool really does represent patient engagement or community engagement. It had really similar construct to other tools that were trying to measure the same thing. And it also is precise, so it is valid, it's accurate, and it's precise. And in terms of for floor and ceiling effect, we also see that it's when an individual complete it, it's likely that most persons will not be getting the highest or the lowest score. So there is always sort of room usually for the average person, if you may, they'll be able to improve on their patient engagement moving forward. And so that's a good scale in terms of that. And we also have interpretability for the scores. And so what ended up happening here is that we have a 22-item scale, and in testing it individuals typically complete it within 3 to 7 minutes. And here is an example of one of the items from the field valued subscale. So here we see for field valued, the research project team appreciated my contributions. And there are sort of, in terms of interpretation of the scores, there are 4 kind of degrees of meaningfulness, and those are cut points in terms of what the different scores mean. And then we also here show that the individual scores, they can be, the items fall along a continuum from foundational to intermediate to advanced meaningfulness. And so they're kind of interesting things that you can do with the individual items themselves when it comes to understanding if you are engaging with your community partners well. I think this is over to you.
All right. Actually, it's not.
Yeah. And so we saw recently there was a paper published, actually from here in the States, where a systematic review was done on community engagement in research scales, quantitative engagement measurement scales, and the peers itself came out here as the author says that though none of the scales met all of the kind of criteria for strong measurement tools, the peers and another scale have been most thoroughly tested such that they are ready for implementation. And there you see that red dot where there wasn't cross-cultural validation of the peers. We went ahead and that was done, and there was a publication, our Danish version of the scale published. And so the work has even continued to advance beyond that publication. And over to you.
Great. So now what? This took years and hours and hours and hours of work to develop from the community perspective how we define and can measure reliably, rigorously, community engagement. So how can you use it? Let's give an example. So this was part of a team that looked at how they measured their engagement of their community partners. If we go to the next slide. So this is an example. There were 15 community partners then that used the PAIRS 22. And what we tried to identify, those red squares, are the lowest scores for each individual. That helps the team identify where there are opportunities to improve that engagement. So it's not just looking at the total score and saying, okay, great, we were at an intermediate level or at an advanced level. More importantly, you can use the scale to identify where there are opportunities specifically to target to improve your engagement. And how did we determine, what did we do with that then? Once we identified the lowest scores, we undertook something called a deliberative dialogue, where there was a lay summary presented to everybody that attended the workshop. They then had a process of small and large group discussion to identify solution statements. How could you move from those low scores for those individual items to higher scores? Everybody, including the community partners, identified possible solutions to those low scores. And then there was a subsequent survey after the workshop, and further consensus to develop the recommendations that everybody on the team agreed to in order to move from the lowest, the opportunities for improvement. How could you actually achieve those? What actions could be taken? And
And then that was put on a task form to be able to see, like a dashboard, to say, okay, have we done this? Are we currently doing this, or is it done? So recommendations were developed for each of those low scores. Everybody agreed to what was going to happen. And that was like a form of accountability back to the community members to say, we're going to make this even better. Next slide. So what's the take-home message? It's quantitatively based, using qualitative work as well as quantitative work that was rigorously tested then over multiple iterations to improve engagement in research. It's validated, and it really is about the meaningful engagement which can facilitate the co-creation of actionable recommendations.
Thank you, Alison. And to finish up, there's actually a recently funded project here in the U.S., a PCORI-funded project that is continuing some work on the peers. We are not part of that work, but it's been done out of Henry Ford Health Systems, where Sarah Santarosa is a researcher there, is funded to do some further validation of the peers with a diverse group of participants. I believe they have a panel of over 400 community partners there in Michigan. And so they are working on that. And thank you, everyone.
Good morning. Well, we were not that quantitative in our work. Really very impressive, and I already have a wish list of places where I want to use this tool. So thank you so much. Pointing to the wrong place. Okay. Go back. So it's my job to introduce to you the experience that we had in a project called IDEAL, which stands for Individuals with IDD Engaged, Aligned, and Leading. So before I get to the list of our, the breadth of our engagement, I'll just explain that the goal of this project was to understand from IDD stakeholders what the most important life and health outcomes are to them. What matters most? Because we need to know what matters most in order to design healthcare and deliver healthcare and hold healthcare accountable for what matters. So the ideal community had many dimensions. First, there was a leadership team. And I know sometimes, you know, when people say, oh, this project couldn't have happened without so-and-so, and they mean it, but it's a little bit of like a figurative thing. This project literally could not have happened without Teal Benevides at Augusta. Institute for Exceptional Care, Brandeis University, and the National Committee on Quality Assurance. And I'll explain who they are later. We also had a core team with representation from each of the key partner categories that we wanted to get insights from and be guided by. So depending on the phase of the project, that core team included 5 to 8 members representing IDD self-advocates, family members, clinicians, health systems, payers, government, and researchers. We then also had an advisory council representing the same groups but with additional people so that we could get more of a diversity of views. And then we had graphic facilitation from a wonderful artist at Calibri Facilitation named Tim Corey. In addition, so the core team and advisory council and Calibri were with us throughout the project continuously. However, when it came time to make decisions about, gee, how do we prioritize all of the outcomes that were put forward, and how do we set national goals to achieve those outcomes over the next 10 years, we felt it was important to bring in an even larger group of people. So you start to get this sense of a growing set of concentric circles that brings in more and more and more perspectives, building on what came before, never eliminating what came before. So we recruited a consensus work group based on nominations from our core team and advisory council, and that consensus work group gathered in person in order to help define those priorities. So this is a little bit backwards, but actually where it started was with individual contributors who were not on the core team, who were not on the advisory council, but some of whom did end up on the consensus working group. And you see their numbers listed here. But we actually, for the self-advocates, we actually held one-on-one conversations first to elicit their health stories, to give them a chance to process the questions at their tempo. And then we turned to the family members and we said, you can't take anything away from what they said, but what would you add? And then we turned to the clinicians and we said, you definitely can't take anything away from what the first two groups said, but how can you support the priorities that they named, and what do you need to do that? And then we turned to the payers and regulators and said, what do you need to support each of the other three groups? And then lastly, after all that was done, and we had a consensus set of outcome domains and the healthcare elements that support them and draft national goals, we held 2 policy summits with a total of about 60 leaders from many government agencies, federal and state, foundations, research organizations, and clinical groups. And that was in part for us to share with them what the group developed so we could plant the seeds for change, but also to get their input on what the challenges and opportunities there might be that we would trip over as we try to push forward these national goals. So in all, over 200 contributors to this project to define what outcomes matter most for the IDD community and how to move that forward. So I talked you through this process, and really, what this allowed us to do was, one, for healthcare experts to stand back and not feel the pressure of having to have the answer to everything all the time. They loved that sensation, it turned out. But the community identified the key barriers and possible easy wins to improve these outcomes. We also, in the beginning, only had funding to talk to, I think, 50 people, and we got additional funding to expand that for that first phase of smaller group conversations. And we produced a health outcomes consensus document. The national goals are now publicly accessible on IEC's website. And we also have several publications either out there in the world or in process. And the first one was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in August that lays out this community-led health policy agenda to achieve the outcomes that matter most. That is a delightful mouthful to say. This is, again, just going into more detail. We recruited and convened this work group of people with different backgrounds to review the outcomes that our community members identified. And each of them had I don't know, half a dozen or more healthcare elements that people thought were really important. So for example, in the domain, and you'll see some of the domains later, of physical health, which people really thought of as maximized energy and minimized pain. Look at that. No mention of hemoglobin A1C or blood pressure. The healthcare elements they really wanted were that their clinician would give them all the information they needed and support them in shared decision making. Okay. Then we held that in-person meeting to draft the national goals, and then we held the policy summits, and then we had the products come out. So that was phase 2. Now we are in phase 3. And now that we have these priority domains, of which there are 9, and these priority elements, of which 8 domains? 9 domains. There are 29 elements across those 9 domains. We have to find a way to measure them. And so that's what phase 3 is about. So this is where the National Committee on Quality Assurance is a key partner, because they accredit all the health insurance plans in the US. And they also develop quality measures. So they are helping us to scan existing quality metrics to see which ones would align to the key elements in IDEAL. And then they will help the community draft recommendations on how to fill gaps where no good measures currently exist. And there are quite a number of gaps. Because that's what happens when you ask people what's important as opposed to asking clinicians or payers what's important. We'll convene another consensus group and draft recommendations on whether and how specific measures should be used in the short term and the long term, and on next steps. So for example, we're likely to say, hey, there are a bunch of potentially great measures, but they've never been piloted or tested in people with IDD, and that really needs to happen next. So wanted to just show you some of Tim's beautiful illustrations, which were reviewed, refined, and approved by our stakeholders. And here you see the domains. I'll share them on 2 slides. Making healthy choices. And you can see how people thought of that in part was being able to use my own body and having healthy movements. The second domain was physical health, reduced pain, and maximized energy. The third was doing the things I love and need to do. Imagine that as a health outcome. OT. Okay, OT. I know primary care physicians who would weep if you offered them the chance to just be held accountable for solving their patients' problems so that their patients could live how they want. They would weep with relief and joy. The fourth domain was emotional or mental health. And the fifth domain was sexual, reproductive health, and parenting. Because it is so easy for healthcare to forget that people with IDD want to have healthy sexual lives. And yes, some of them want and can parent. The sixth domain was acknowledging that family caregivers and partners also need wellness and support, because without them, the person they are supporting would be much worse off. The seventh was workforce development, in acknowledgement, including among the clinicians who were in the rooms, that clinicians are very poorly prepared to serve this population. And I know my own kind. When a clinician is underconfident, only one of 2 things happen. Either they lash out or they shut down. Domain 8 was system supports. And this was an acknowledgement that there are many structures and processes that no individual clinical practice or payer or government agency controls, but that everyone has to build together, such as a system for helping families navigate the many different kinds of supports that they need. And then the last outcome was really what payers and regulators need. And it's just, I think, subconscious that the live transcription is covering that up. But they do need help too. They, the best intended payers and regulators recognize that they too are constrained in what they can do. For example, when government puts out laws and regulations that contradict one another, and or aren't the same across different states, that makes it really challenging for, say, a national insurance company to make the investments in, say, changing their operations or changing how they design their health plan products to meet people's needs. So I want to turn it over now to Huan, who was one of the participants, both as an individual contributor and then as a member of the consensus work group. And it's pure coincidence that we're both Vietnamese.
Yes. We're just going to play Huan's message that he has already prepared. Go ahead.
Good morning, I am Huan Vuong, and I am a 27-year-old autistic. I am mainly nonverbal, and I spell to communicate. I'd like to tell you my story, how I have lacked a community growing up, and how my newly found community, or communities, has improved my life. Throughout my school years, I was denied communication support, access to age-appropriate curriculum, full inclusion with my non-disabled peers, and the full school experience. Such segregation had excluded me from the general community and continued into my adult life and my employment. I left school without a diploma and an education. I went on to get my high school diploma online and a 2-year associate's degree from Northern Virginia Community College. Having always been segregated, I never felt accepted in my neighborhood. At work as a floor associate at Goodwill, customers shunned and insulted me when I could not speak to answer their questions. The general population seems to be unaware of disabled individuals' abilities, that we can lead independent lives and participate in the workforce. I moved into an inclusive and affordable apartment building 4 years ago. Thanks to a nonprofit organization called Our Stomping Ground, I was able to participate in daily activities with my neighbors and friends in the community. They started to accept me for who I was, with my shortcomings and my strengths. These developments have greatly improved my self-confidence and outlook in life. The world still hasn't fully accepted the disabled population with patience and compassion, but we are moving in the right direction. I was very fortunate and thankful to have been able to participate in the IDEAL project with a team of outstanding professionals. The health outcomes framework focused on so many diverse aspects of the disabled individual's health issues such as their physical and mental health, health providers and caregivers. Their quality of life was also focused on, with subjects such as determining their activity preferences, and how to provide them a caring and inclusive community. While working on this project, I related so much to these subjects because I lived the issues that were raised. I was very happy that the team discussed and proposed resolutions to these issues to improve the life of a disabled individual. Working on the IDEAL project was one of the greatest professional experiences of my life. The project was well planned and very organized. There were individual prep calls to prepare me for the upcoming general meetings. Well-documented materials were sent beforehand to the team and meetings were organized and well thought out with small group sessions. I was treated with respect and my opinions were taken seriously. I felt that I belonged and that I was part of another community. I'd like to thank them for giving me a voice to advocate for myself. I hope that more disabled individuals can be included in opportunities like these, because self-advocating will help change their lives for the better.
So we can have scales, but we also have testimonials like that. And for IEC, when we see the light come on in our participants' eyes, or we see that aha movement from the healthcare community, who also walks out changed from this process, I know that's very difficult to capture in a scale, but it can be documented.
I just want to thank each of you for your giving of yourselves through these processes and projects. It's such a tremendous honor to hear about the work and peers and your continued efforts to ensure that patient perspectives are measured. And in an ideal, the qualitative elements are critical to the stories and experiences that payers and regulators hear them and then are interested in continuing to join forces to address these goals. So I want to say, I think as OTs, we value both qualitative and quantitative. And in our conceptions of outcome measures, for example, in IDEAL, you're having to think about the health systems requiring some sort of quantitative measure, but you also then go back to the qualitative and then back up to the quantitative. And your peers model did the same thing. You started with the qualitative and then you went quantitative and then you went back to qualitative to gather information on how to refine it. And so I just want to point out that these were two very different projects involving experiences of community partners in changing and shifting what we do, but using similar approaches. And so hopefully people have had an opportunity to see how they could be used. What I'd like to do now is to ask our audience to answer questions that our panelists posed of you. And so these questions came from both teams that are here on the stage, and we would like you within your group, your table, to answer them and talk about them with one another. And if you'd like, you can put them on the Google Doc so that I could share them with others later. The first question for you as an audience is, what are your suggestions for ways to help address the challenges of measuring engagement in research? And the second question that you could consider answering, you can answer one or both, is based on what we presented, will you include more self-advocates in your research? If yes, what have you learned that will support this effort? Panelists. So, does any table want to answer what you came up with for either one of these questions that the panelists asked you? Okay, we have a brave group. Vanessa. Great, yes. Yes, brief is good.
Okay. We'll just share one of the things that we talked about. We had many others that are on the Google Doc, but one of the barriers that we talked about that I think needs to be considered by the entire team is that when you're measuring stakeholder partner engagement, that is not a way that you're unintentionally maybe othering them if they're the only ones taking the assessment. So just like, I think, and the ways to get around that is obviously like how you talk about it to your team. Maybe there's measures that can be done for both the researchers and academic partners, but just being really conscientious of that, because now all of a sudden now they're participants instead of partners. So just thinking, about those pieces.
Great point. Do our panelists want to respond to that?
Such a great point. And I've worked with several teams that have deliberated on this. And I'm working with one team that is looking at pharmacogenomic testing for depression. So can we identify, for people living with depression, which drugs are safe and effective using testing? And on that team, there are a number of community partners living with depression. When you only have 4 community partners, or 6 community partners, and you have a score and you're doing that, you can out people in how they respond to a scale. You could identify them. So all members of the research team undertake the evaluation, because it's not rocket science. Although it was rigorously developed, this is how all people want to be treated and acknowledged. So there's no reason why you need to evaluate only the community partner experience. You can also evaluate the entire team experience.
Okay, another table. We have another brave soul.
Well, it might be hard to measure, but we're wondering if how you might measure engagement could be determined by how much you changed the project in the process as a result of what your partners teach you. You know, from this morning when Dr. Watkins suggested something in your plan should change over time, we're thinking that that's a measurement, although maybe hard to measure.
So if I can summarize that, how do you track change over time as your project improves engagement? Do you mind if I give it to this team and then to you? Okay.
Oh my God, the number of edits that we made and the number of changes to our processes. I mean, we could probably go back and find version history, but I think subconsciously we were doing that. And I think that's what Juan was referring to, that, you know, he felt his input was taken into account, is that things did change. And sometimes we had to go back to the funder and say, we're going to do something different because our community said so. The original grants, neither one of them included policy summits, right? It was when we got into the room with the 40-plus people in the consensus work group that's like, yeah, you don't have enough policymakers here. You should hold a summit. And we're like, okay.
Yeah, I think the take-home message here is measure more than once. I mean, once is one data point. And if you only measure twice, you'll always get a straight line. The more you measure, the more frequently you measure, so maybe beginning, intermediate, and end, it only takes 3 to 7 minutes. So why would you only measure once? If you want to see if you're continuing to improve the quality of that engagement, measure on multiple times.
Does anyone want to answer the second question that Juan posed about, based on what we presented, will you include more self-advocates, and if yes, what will you do? Did I hear anyone? Okay. We gave other tables a chance.
We had planned on including self-advocates in our research, but one of the things that was really important that I feel that I learned for our team was the idea of the prep phone call, of the prep work. And I think I'd kind of thought about it, but being very intentional with how's the best way that I can prep you for what it is that I need you to do. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have an answer to either of these questions? We'll do one more, and then we'll do questions for the panelists about their presentations. No? Okay, so I'm going to go back up to the panel. We did have a question about the peers, specifically what patient population was your tool validated on, and to whom is it generalizable to, and what are other people doing too in some of their other studies?
Great question. So it's a question around the generalizability, sort of what population could the peers be used with. And so in terms of when we were doing the initial development and validation work, we did try to engage with like a diverse population in terms of race, ethnicity, in terms of age. Persons who were involved were as young as 17 to, I believe, 80-something years old. But there are certain questions we didn't ask. We didn't specifically ask about sort of what health condition or whether one would have had kind of a certain disability and so on. And so those are missing sort of kind of data points for us. So we don't understand currently what that looks like. Initially, with that initial thematic analysis that we did to form the framework, that involved several people with arthritis. But as we went through the process, for example, when it came to the item selection, we involved individuals, substance use, different like HIV, for example, different health conditions, not only persons with lived and living experience, but also family members. So it was very diverse throughout the different stages of the project. So I can't pinpoint specifically, but I know that it's being used in so many different populations now. So the sort of validation is ongoing because it's proven to be effective and useful tool. For example, in Parkinson's, in the UK. It's used in a diverse population in cancer, for example, in the Danish version. Throughout Canada, there are so many. It's been used in youth. Brain injury, it's used here in the United States. There was one of the first studies published from it out of Harvard, and we're using the tool. And so there are so many different places it's been used, so which helps for its continuous kind of validation, whether it's a useful tool. And the work, I'm sure, that is being done by Sarah out of Michigan will continue, will show some promise there as well around its generalizability.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I think there's a few more that were submitted. Good. You didn't raise your hand?
Did not have.
Okay.
I just have a question for you. You're reporting that you had a very diverse group of people, ethnically and racially and culturally. But if you didn't ask the disability question, how do you know that your disability participants represented a broad array of disability diversity?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know that it does represent, but there are subsequent studies coming out. For example, when it comes to in the development of the questionnaire or the scale, we had online sort of survey. It was done through an online survey. That in and of itself is not necessarily accessible to all. It might not be accessible in terms of availability of technology. So already it's limiting certain community partners from being able to participate in the work. So I wouldn't be able to say that. I think ongoing work, and that's the nature of developing a scale, in that it should always continue on to the process of validation. That is why we don't necessarily say that it's valid, but we say that it has been validated, it has undergone validation, but there will be continuous. So if there are any persons here who want to specifically look at its validation for any specific group with any disability, I'd be happy to talk with you. And I don't need to be a part of the research, but I can also provide advice and so on to your work. And I'm sure Alison as well would be happy to speak with you as well. But Alison is a very busy person.
All right, other questions from the audience?
This question is for the researchers with the IDEAL project. It sounds like you included a lot of participants with a variety of communication styles. And I know one of the things is I advocate for inclusion of people with a variety of communication styles in research. Some researchers struggle with how do you do that? How do you maintain the validity of the research when accommodating for communication partners or for a need for a different response style?
So just to clarify, the IDEAL project was not formal research per se. It was eliciting community input and guidance to develop a solution for healthcare. But all that said, I can share some of the strategies that we used and some of the learnings. So one, for example, we didn't assume that people had digital supports. So to participate in the meetings, they did have to get to a computer, but we first, asked them whether they had that and also whether they needed help filling out forms. Because communication is both, digesting information as well as communicating it. For participants, contributors like Juan, who used assistive devices, we welcome them. We slowed down the group discussion so that there would be time for those contributors to express themselves. We offered live transcription. We encouraged people to use the chat if they were more in the Zoom meeting, if they were more comfortable typing than not. And I think one thing that we haven't discussed on the panel that is really important to draw out, if you go to IEC's website, you will see under our work engagement, and if you look in there, there's actually a set of guiding principles around authentic engagement. And we have a whole bunch of processes and tools that we use behind all those principles. But one of those has to do with how you bring the non-disabled contributors along, how you set group norms, how you role model what inclusivity looks like. And so when someone has communication differences, the entire group is prepared to be supportive. And it is not just coming from the project leaders, because that would not be really meaningful engagement, right? We'd be setting them up for potential hostility or misunderstanding. And sometimes we would have to intervene to remind people to slow down and to give space. But Juan, do you have more you would want to add to that?
That's good. He said, no, that's good.
Other questions? We have time for one more.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the question that we put to you. I think you answered this for the first group. Can you use your measure as a repeat measure, as an outcome measure, so that you can continue to look at engagement over time, or if your interventions to support engagement are working.
I think we both can answer this. Do you want to go first, Alison?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We've been doing some work actually just now in the implementation of the peers at an organization called OMERACT, which is an international organization having to do with the development of outcome measures for rheumatoid arthritis, for rheumatic diseases. And so it's an international organization where we're looking to measure change over time. And it's a rigorous process of completing the tool, but also having kind of documenting the change and seeing sort of with intervention how the quality of engagement will change over time. So when we develop the scale, as it's one of the things that I talked about was this sort of having it being kind of like a ruler, and because we developed it in that way where it was more like a ruler, where we had the different cut points. I think with that, you're able to, if individuals move across those cut points, you're able to detect that there is change in sort of their level of meaningful engagement. There is still opportunity for further validation of the tool around this idea of responsiveness, it's called, where it's kind of a testing of change. What change is meaningful change? In terms of the scale itself, we identify that different levels of the scale represent different levels of meaningfulness, but what we haven't done is to say what degree of change on the scale is meaningful change. So it's to answer, it's a yes, but by how much change is meaningful, we haven't done that work yet. It's kind of a psychometric or measurement property work that needs to be done through intervention work.
It's still an incredible amount of work that all of you have done in your work to understand outcomes and measure meaningful change in engagement. So I just want to